Hello family, it's African Esquire and I'm here with a new video. Today I'm going to be reviewing the movie, or not really reviewing, but just giving some takeaways from the movie Blackkklansman. I went to go see the movie last night and I had a lot of thoughts pertaining to the movie. And I had a lot of thoughts going into the movie also because of a criticism that was written about the movie by Boots Riley. And what he kind of said, and I read before I even went to the movie, was that the movie kind of overshadows or doesn't give justice to the fact that police informants were a key part of disseminating the Black liberation movements and played a key part in completely demolishing the Black Panther Party, completely demolishing the effects of the Nation of Islam or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. These police informants are key tools that were used by the system of white supremacy in order to dismantle any attempts by African people to liberate ourselves. So going into the movie with that criticism in mind, I was very analytical of the fact that Spike Lee chose to do a movie about a police officer who infiltrated the Klan, but this same police officer also infiltrated the Black liberation movement. In particular, he was an informant on the great Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael. So my the general synopsis of the movie is about a Black cop, and he's not he goes into the police force, I guess, optimistic. And let me first say, spoiler alert, you know, I'm about to give the synopsis of the movie. So maybe you want to come back to this after you've seen it, if you do plan on seeing it. But basically, it's about a Black cop who goes into the police force with the intent to become a great police officer. And he doesn't really have a good political sense of what it means to be Black, but he does have a sense of what it means to want to be someone who serves their country and someone who wants to become a part of the police force. So this man joins the police force, and he wants to go higher in the police force because first they basically put him on like desk duty or looking up fouls, you know, treat him like a foul clerk, and he really wants to become like a real actual cop. So the way that he becomes a real actual cop is by putting himself out there saying, I'm willing to be an informant on or go undercover and actually do those types of operations. So of course, seeing a Black man that's willing to go undercover, the first thing that they decide to put him in, the first undercover operation they decide to put him in, is a speech that was held by Kwame Ture, where he was brought to a school to speak at a student union, and basically that was his first job. So I did agree with Boots Riley that this completely, you know, did not give credit to the fact that these informants, they weren't just people who were trying to become police and people trying to help their country. They really were people who betrayed the Black liberation movement. You're going into these circles where there are people who are trying to liberate us, and rather than joining in, you are going back to the police force in order to tell them everything that you know, or try to discredit, you know, what is happening inside of Black America and not actually give credence to what's going on in Black America. And instead, you're basically just going to betray the revolution. And that was really what happened often over and over again. You see, for example, with the assassination of Malcolm X, there were informants that were present on the scene when he was assassinated, which means, and one of which was actually his bodyguard, who was supposed to be on stage with Malcolm whenever he was assassinated, but just, I guess by happenstance, he happened to be in the crowd instead of on stage with him. With Marcus Garvey, there were informants inside of the UNIA who completely decimated the organization and spread lies and allowed for him to be tried for something that he didn't commit. Over and over again, any type of attempt to liberate Black people that was actually able to work potentially, or able to gather the hearts of African people in America, anytime that happened, not just in the United States, but anytime that happened anywhere in the diaspora or anywhere on the continent, you've seen that there were key people who were of African descent who were put into these positions in order to try to derail the efforts of these organizations and of these leaders. So I did think it was very interesting that Spike Lee would be the one making this movie. And I think it's interesting because of the history of Spike Lee. As Boots Riley pointed out, this is the same person who did the movie Malcolm X. And while it's true, you know, there are other things Spike Lee has done, this Malcolm X to me was probably the most important thing he's ever done, the most important credit to his name. Although it did not get an Oscar, we know that Spike Lee will forever be remembered as the person that did Malcolm X. So you did a movie about the leader, and now you're doing a movie about the person who would have possibly betrayed the leader. Had he been around 10 years earlier, he probably would have been the same type of person to be put in the Nation of Islam in order to inform the U.S. government on what was going on in there. So it was interesting that he did that. I'll talk about that a little bit more about Spike Lee then versus Spike Lee now. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is that he really hits on this concept. And again, remember, Spike Lee in the early 90s or late 80s, Spike Lee 2018. So he really hits on this concept that not all cops are bad. And, you know, when we say not all cops are bad, of course not all cops go into the force wanting to do bad to black people, wanting to do bad to any people. Of course, you know, by nature, you would hope that people have human nature and people are going to be kind to people or be fair to people at least. So I don't think anyone has that concept that every single person that enters the police force is someone that's out to get black people. At the same time, it's the blue wall of silence, which to me compromises your position as saying that I'm not someone who's against black people, or I'm the black cop in this movie, Ron Stallworth was his name. He said, well, yeah, I'm for black liberation, but I believe I could fix the system from within. But if you understand the culture of policing, that there's this blue wall of silence, that anyone who does something in the organization that is wrong or does something that is abuse of power, that no one else is supposed to speak out against that. How can you say that you're for our people if you would willingly enter into this system, or also be afraid and scared to actually speak out and be a whistleblower whenever you see cops doing corrupt things? You see what happened in Baltimore. There's a black cop who beat up a black man for no reason, just started pummeling him with his fist. And what did you have right next to him? Another black man who wouldn't even stop him, but instead would just stand by him complacently as he watched this cop beat the mess out of this man who could have potentially killed him. And we see this over and over again. And to me personally, if you're not willing to speak out against what's going on in the police department, and if you're not willing to stop things when they're happening in front of you, then to me you're just as wrong as the people who are actually committing the violations of civil rights. You're just as wrong as those cops. So the idea that you can be a good cop just by doing the right thing, although you're going to turn a blind eye to the other cops who are doing wrong inside of the community, that's not a sound position. Imagine the position is basically the same as saying, if you're in a war and you see that some of your fellow soldiers are traitors, and you see that they are going to the other side and giving them supplies and doing things that compromise your position in this war, and you don't say anything. If you think that the army of whatever country you're in is not going to prosecute you for knowing something and not doing something or not stopping it, they're going to prosecute you because they see you as being an accomplice by not speaking out or by not actually caring enough about your position in this war to say that, hey, you're doing something that compromises me, or you're doing something that messes up my image or messes up my position in this, our position as a country. And it's the same thing. If you are in the police department, you're not willing to speak out against what's going on, and you're just sitting by idly and watching what happens, and you're not even willing to speak out against the things that are happening in the police department, then please understand that you are just as culpable as the person who is going out and doing the acts that are hurting the community, especially if you're a black man or a black woman and you're supposed to be the one who's supposed to supposedly make things better, supposedly if we're policed by people who look like us. And I've never subscribed to this position, but supposedly if we're policed by people who look like us, we're supposed to be safer, and that has never been the case. We see that, if anything, you see people that look like us, and they basically become the same type of supremacist power structure, become a part of the supremacist power structure, and instead of change the system, they more times than not conform to the system. So it's very important that we not get into this whole, oh well, you know, there are some good cops, there are some bad cops. If you're not willing, if you're not a cop that's going to speak out against things when you know things are going on, then to me you're just as bad as the cop that actually did the wrong thing. The other thing I thought was interesting about the movie is that Spike Lee kind of paints this picture, and again, remember Spike Lee back in the early 90s and Spike Lee in 2018, he paints this picture of there being like a middle ground. So, and I noticed this also in the movie The Butler, which I hated that movie, but in that movie they had portrayed the Black Panthers as being just these radicals who, you know, yeah, their heart was in the right place, but they weren't, you know, they were taking it too far, and that's kind of what was portrayed in this movie. The Black Panthers, or the Black Liberation Movement, they're seeing as taking it too far, as being too not willing to compromise, and then you have the other side, which is the white racists who are obviously, you know, doing horrible things to Black people, or doing racist things, and you don't want to be on either side of those, but you want to be someone like Ron Stallworth, who was basically, you know, willing to deal with the white racists, but not willing to fully push a Black liberation struggle. And this is where the theme of this video really comes in, and that is psychological conditioning. So we're conditioned to believe that we can walk a middle ground inside of these organizations, that, you know, it's okay if you're in these organizations and you try to put off your blackness. You know, I noticed in the movie they had a scene where, you know, Ron Stallworth, he said, hey, you know, to his police chief, you know, I can speak basically like a white man, and, you know, I can play that character, and I can also speak like a Black man. I can speak Ebonics. I could speak, I think he said jive language back in the 70s. So, you know, he's basically making the case I could be both. And oftentimes we're kind of told that as Black people that it's okay to want to conform to these standards and put on a white voice in order to try to fit into the system as a survival mechanism. And so we're told that there's this middle ground that we can walk, where we're not betraying our people, and yet we're not actually pushing back against the people who are fighting against our people. And this is the conditioning that they're trying to put into us, is that to believe that we could do best for our country, we could do best for our people if we're walking a middle ground, and if we're not definitively on one side versus the other side. And I think that this is absolutely false, because wrong is wrong no matter where it is or where it happens. You know, there's no middle ground inside of any type of war. There's no middle ground inside of the Revolutionary War. There's no middle ground inside of Iraq. There's no middle ground in what they did in Libya. There's no middle ground. If you're not willing to fully do everything in your power to end what's going on the other side, then you are taking part inside of their efforts. If you have to understand that, you know, when people try to equalize, you know, the Black Panthers with the you know, KKK, or with any type of white nationalist group, what they're doing is denying the fact that this has really been a one-sided thing as far as history goes. And what I mean by that is Black people never enslaved white people. Black people never colonized Europe. Black people never raped their slave women, never impregnated the slave women, and sent their husbands away and broke up white families. Black people never did these things. This has been a one-sided thing. Black people have never incarcerated a mass amount of white people. Black people have never infiltrated the white community and spread drugs inside of the white community. This has been a one-sided thing since throughout history. It's been a one-sided victim versus perpetrator relationship. So the same way that we would not tell a rape victim to, hey, you know, you should, you know, try to walk a fine line with the guy who raped you, you know, you should forgive him, and you should, you know, try not to push back too much, because, hey, he might be someone who's going to, you know, be on your side at some point. You should try to win him with love. We would never tell that to a rape victim. Yet the fact that the Black community has been raped, the Black community has been enslaved, the Black community has been put through Jim Crow, has been put through mass incarceration, has been put through the crack epidemic, it's always been us receiving the the attacks, the systematic attacks. Despite the fact that it's been one-sided on our side, we're supposed to not consider ourselves victims, but consider ourselves as, hey, you know, we do things and they do things. We do things and they do things. And that's not the case. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And if it's wrong, I shouldn't have to walk a middle ground and pretend that, you know, if I do things right in this for these people, then they're going to eventually come on my side. You know, when people say these things like, oh, you know, shouldn't we all come together? My thing is, haven't you been watching history? Haven't you been looking at the precedent? And precedent says that no matter how much you beg, no matter how much you try to do good for people, if those people are going to continue to oppress you and continue to be in a position of power over you, they're not going to give up their power. They're not going to stop oppressing you just because you're doing good by them. If anything, sometimes you doing good by them complements their conscience and makes them feel like, well, hey, they're not doing too bad here because, you know, they're nice, they're peaceful, and they're not complaining, and so therefore, you know, we're going to continue doing what we're doing. So understand that the idea that, you know, you can be on both sides, and the idea that there's no one definitive side that's wrong and one definitive side that's right, that idea is what we've been psychologically conditioned to accept, that we can walk a middle ground. But think in terms of what happens inside of war, what happens inside of battles. There's no such thing as a middle ground. So either you're for the people, as the girl kept asking in the movie, are you for the liberation of black people, or are you not? There's no, well, I'm for the liberation of black people, but I'm going to do it within side of the confines of white supremacy. Well, if you're doing it within the confines of white supremacy, then you're not doing it, because you're doing it within the confines of a power structure that has been designed to destroy us. So, you know, I guess that's all I have to say about that. But to get to Spike Lee, I think it's very interesting that I notice, particularly with leaders who have, and I'm not calling Spike Lee a leader, but I guess any type of figure who has been inside of the black community and the black struggle for a long time, who has at one time been considered radical or been considered extreme, or, you know, anything like that. I noticed that over time, a lot of these people go from being very aggressive with their message, being very, you know, this is what it is, and, you know, this is right, this is wrong, being very definitive with their message and with their content, to eventually, you know, basically molding into what the mainstream teaches us. And I noticed that with Spike Lee. You know, the fact that he's created a movie that kind of softens the image of policing inside the black community and makes it seem like police have a good role to play in the black community. And then I look back at, this is the same person who created the music video for Fight the Power, the one that was saying fight the powers that be. And I noticed with a lot of leaders, with a lot of figures, that over time that they become softer and softer towards what the liberal idea of equality is, meaning that we can all, you know, that we're all on the same side, that, you know, a Democrat, Republican, that, hey, the Democrats are for us and the Republicans are not. More and more you see that people mold into that mindset. And my thought on that and why it happens is, I think that over time that a part of people have their hope inside of like the here and now. And when they don't see something happen one way, so for example, if you're, let's say, Eldridge Cleaver, who was a prominent member of the Black Panther Party, he eventually became a very conservative individual and was basically a Republican voice in the later part of his life. So maybe at one point he believed in black liberation and he believed that what he was saying meant something for black people. But because the Panthers were thinking revolution and thinking change happens here and now, all of their stock was in seeing something happen now. But when it didn't happen now, and then you have 10 years going by, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, eventually you kind of look for some type of peace of mind, I think. Because some people don't have it in their mind that we're not struggling for a moment, we're not struggling for a lifetime, we're struggling for a moment. However, my attitude is that we have to understand we're in a constant state of struggle. And struggle does not have a time limit. It does not have a point where it gets better. And if the society has not changed and the system has not changed, then why should your message change? If you're very potent with your message at one point and the society has remained the same 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, then why would you change your message? And, you know, I understand that people like Spike Lee, they're in Hollywood, and, you know, there's only so much you can dream of outside of the confines of Hollywood, you know, because if you're in Hollywood to begin with, that means that you're not going to be the most radical or the most outspoken. But at the same time, just to see the transformation from, I guess, when he was fully in Black Hollywood and he had no leg inside of White Hollywood, so back from Malcolm, back from the Public Enemy days, back from Do the Right Thing, to this movie that essentially propagates the liberal idea that, you know, hey, you know, not all police are bad, and, you know, you can walk a middle ground. You don't have to be all the way Black liberation or all the way racism. There's a middle ground for people who can feel comfortable, and they can do something in the system. You can change the system from within the system, and even though, you know, you're in the wrong system, you can still change it from within. And, you know, I've never known of anyone who's changed anything from within, because if anything, if there's a corporate culture, you're going to conform to that culture. But in the liberal mindset, no, you know, come into our organizations, come into our structures. We'll make you a change agent. You'll be someone that changes things. And this is what I think he ends up subscribing to. So I'm just saying that to say, I've noticed that over time, that the most militant, the most pro-Black, a lot of times mold into becoming someone who is basically voicing or speaking the same things that the establishment wants us to think are legitimate. And that is that Black liberation is not an attainable goal. If anything, Black integration into the American system, that is what the only goal should be. One more comment I'm going to make on the psychological conditioning aspect has nothing to do with this movie, but it has to do with Minister Louis Farrakhan. I don't know if you all noticed or paid attention to the Aretha Franklin's funeral, but Minister Farrakhan was one of the guests at the funeral. And when you notice about well, first of all, not only was he one of the guests at the funeral, he was on the section of highest honors at the funeral. He was seated. Bill Clinton was on the far left, and this is the beginning of the service. Bill Clinton, Al Sharpton, Al Sharpton, I think Jesse Jackson, and then Farrakhan. All four of them were seated on the same stage, and anyone who knows the history of the Nation of Islam, of Minister Farrakhan, and what he said against the Clintons, what he said against Jesse Jackson, should know that that's very interesting that they had that four sitting up there up on the stage. The media, because the media wants to give this idea that Farrakhan is not loved by Black people, that Farrakhan is not relevant to us, that he's just an old leader who is a hateful leader, who's a fringe element of the Black community, that he's an extremist, that the mainstream of Black people don't accept. They want to give that image, and so you either seen two reactions by media outlets. One was to try to act like he wasn't there. You know, some showed images they did not feature Farrakhan, but featured the other three leaders. But then other ones just went right in and said, anti-Semite Farrakhan is at Aretha Franklin's funeral. This is psychological conditioning on both sides, but in particular, the side that pretended that he wasn't there. Understand that when we have people who we still stick by, and I know a lot of Black people would denounce Farrakhan because a lot of Black people probably never done their research on Minister Farrakhan. But for those of us who have, and we understand that he's a complex individual, and you can't take one statement that he might have made years ago and say, well, this is all he is, because many times he said other things and spoken so much better things. So those of us who see the bigger picture, we don't take one moment as being the all-encompassing figure or image of Minister Louis Farrakhan. But understand that their way of trying to condition us is to make us think that the people who are speaking for us, the people who are speaking liberation, true liberation, not this tokenized integration liberation, but true liberation, that they don't exist and that they are irrelevant to us. So understand that was very intentional to leave him out of certain pictures or to completely leave him out of the headlines. You know, they said, oh, Bill Clinton's at the funeral, Al Sharpton's at the funeral, Jesse Jackson's at the funeral. Nothing about Farrakhan. That was very intentional. So this is all psychological conditioning to give black people the image that these leaders, or any leader who speaks definitively for us, who is not compromised by any white liberal structure or any white structure period, that those people are not the representatives of us. So just keep that in mind as we talk about things like psychological conditioning. That's all I have for this video. I will see you all in another video.